The strange thing about heartbreak is that it doesn't always arrive with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it arrives dressed in a black evening gown, holding a champagne glass, standing just beyond a doorway while the man she loves destroys her world with a single sentence. I remember the exact moment because everything about that night had seemed perfect until then. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered warm light across polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly near the grand staircase while Manhattan glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. I stood near the entrance to the private lounge, adjusting the diamond bracelet Adrian had given me on our third wedding anniversary. Everyone in the city knew Adrian Romano. Some admired him. Some feared him. Most never truly knew him. I thought I did. I thought being his wife meant I understood the man beneath the tailored suits, beneath the power, beneath the carefully controlled expression he showed the world. That night proved how wrong I was. I had stepped away from the charity gala to find him. The auction was about to begin, and several guests were asking for him. As I approached the partially open lounge door, I heard laughter. Familiar voices. Business associates. Friends. Men who had known Adrian for years. I was about to walk in when someone asked a question. It sounded harmless at first. Casual. The kind of thing people say after a few drinks. What would you do if Claire ever left you? More laughter followed. I smiled without meaning to. I expected Adrian to dismiss the question. Maybe joke about it. Maybe roll his eyes. Instead there was a pause. Just long enough for me to stop moving. Just long enough for my hand to freeze against the doorframe. Then Adrian answered. Calmly. Effortlessly. Without hesitation. If Claire left tomorrow, life would go on. The words settled over the room. A few men chuckled. Someone made another joke. But I never heard it. Because all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. Life would go on. Not I'd miss her. Not I'd fight for her. Not I can't imagine that happening. Life would go on. I stared at the floor because suddenly the room felt unsteady beneath me. For years I had rearranged my life around his. I had canceled trips. Missed holidays. Eaten countless dinners alone while waiting for him to come home. I had defended him when people questioned him. Believed in him when no one else could reach him. Loved him through every long night and every difficult season. And apparently if I disappeared tomorrow, life would simply continue. I wanted to walk into that room. I wanted to ask him if he truly meant it. But something stopped me. Maybe pride. Maybe heartbreak. Maybe the quiet realization that if I had to ask, I already knew the answer. So I stepped back. Slowly. Silently. No one noticed. No one followed. The music from the ballroom drifted through the hallway as I forced myself to smile for strangers and pose for photographs and play the role everyone expected. But inside something had changed. Something important. Something final. And while Adrian Romano continued enjoying the evening, completely unaware of what had happened, I made a decision that would change both of our lives forever. The next morning I woke up before sunrise, even though I had barely slept at all. The digital clock beside the bed glowed 5:17 a.m. in pale blue numbers, and for a moment I stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Adrian was beside me, asleep on his back, one arm resting across the expensive sheets. From a distance he looked peaceful, younger somehow, less like the man who controlled boardrooms and negotiations and impossible decisions every day. Less like the man whose words had followed me home from the gala like a shadow I could not escape. I turned my head and studied him in the dim light filtering through the curtains. 3 years ago, I would have reached for his hand. 3 years ago, seeing him asleep beside me would have made me feel safe. This morning, I felt like a stranger sharing a room with someone I no longer understood. I slipped quietly out of bed and walked downstairs. The mansion felt enormous before dawn. Every room seemed too large. Too empty. The kitchen lights cast a warm glow across the marble countertops as I brewed coffee. The familiar smell filled the air, but even that comfort felt different now. I wrapped both hands around the mug and stood by the window overlooking the city. New York was beginning to wake up. Headlights moved along distant streets. Office buildings glowed against the dark horizon. Life was going on. The thought made something ache inside my chest. Adrian came downstairs nearly an hour later. He loosened his tie as he entered the kitchen, already checking messages on his phone. His schedule had always been relentless. Meetings, calls, events, endless responsibilities. I used to admire his dedication. Now I wondered how many years I had spent competing with it. "Morning," he said casually. "Morning." He kissed my cheek without looking up from the screen. It was automatic. A habit. The kind of gesture people perform without thinking. Then he poured himself coffee and started discussing a dinner event later that week. He talked while scrolling through emails. Talked while answering a text. Talked while reviewing his calendar. I realized halfway through the conversation that he had not once looked directly at me. Not once. And somehow that hurt more than the sentence itself. The days that followed settled into a strange routine. Outwardly, nothing changed. We attended functions, shared meals, smiled for photographs. The perfect couple everyone expected us to be. But inside, something had shifted. I started noticing things I had ignored before. The empty chair across from me during late dinners. The unread books I had bought while waiting for him to come home. The vacations we postponed. The promises that quietly disappeared beneath more urgent priorities. One afternoon, I opened an old storage box in my home office. Inside were photographs from our first year together. Beach trips. Road trips. Ordinary moments. Adrian smiling without a phone in his hand. Adrian laughing so hard he could barely stand. Adrian looking at me like I was the most important person in the room. I sat on the floor for almost an hour holding those pictures. Trying to remember when everything had changed. Trying to remember when I had started becoming invisible. That night, Adrian returned home after midnight. I heard his footsteps in the hallway. Heard him pause outside my office door. For a second I thought he might come inside. Ask what I was doing. Notice the photographs scattered around me. Notice me. But after a moment, his footsteps continued toward the bedroom. And as the sound faded into the distance, a quiet realization settled over me. The most dangerous part of losing someone is not the moment they walk away. It is the moment they stop believing you would notice if they did. People think disappearing begins with packing a suitcase. They are wrong. It begins much earlier. In the quiet moments when you stop expecting someone to notice your absence. Over the next week, I started seeing my life with a clarity that felt almost cruel. Every morning followed the same pattern. Adrian left before sunrise or shortly after. Every evening he came home late, carrying the weight of a world that always seemed more important than the one waiting for him here. I stopped asking when he would be back. Stopped sending messages to check whether he had eaten. Stopped rearranging my schedule around his. At first he did not seem to notice. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I drove into the city alone. The windshield wipers moved back and forth as Manhattan blurred beneath gray clouds. Years ago, I had dreamed of opening a small art studio. Nothing extravagant. Just a warm space filled with sunlight and paint and people who wanted to create something beautiful. I had even rented a tiny studio apartment above a bookstore before meeting Adrian. After our wedding, I kept the lease for a while. Then life became busy. His life became my life. The dream slowly disappeared beneath meetings, charity events, and obligations. Yet as I parked outside the old building that afternoon, I realized something surprising. The studio was still available. The elderly landlord recognized me immediately. "Claire Foster," he said with a smile. "I have not seen you in years." Neither had I thought quietly. Not the real version of myself. I spent an hour walking through the empty space. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon light. The wooden floors creaked beneath my shoes. The room was smaller than I remembered. Imperfect. Ordinary. And somehow it felt more like home than the mansion I had been living in for 3 years. That evening I returned home carrying brochures and notes tucked inside my purse. Adrian was already there for once. He sat in his office behind a massive oak desk, surrounded by glowing computer screens and stacks of paperwork. For a moment, I stood in the doorway watching him, waiting, hoping he might look up. Maybe ask about my day. Maybe notice the excitement I had not felt in years. Instead, he continued typing. "Everything okay?" he asked without lifting his eyes from the screen. "Yes," I replied. "Everything is fine." The answer sounded strange coming from my own mouth. Fine. Such a simple word for something that was quietly breaking apart. Later that night, I opened a fresh notebook and began writing. Not a goodbye letter. Not yet. Just a list. Things I had always wanted to do. Places I wanted to visit. Goals I had abandoned. Dreams I had postponed. The list grew longer than I expected. When I finally looked up, nearly 2 hours had passed. I heard Adrian's voice drifting from downstairs as he spoke on the phone. Calm, confident, in control. The same voice that could command a room full of powerful people. The same voice that once made me feel chosen. I closed the notebook and stared out the window toward the city lights. For the first time in years, I was not imagining a future built around Adrian Romano. I was imagining one built around myself. And somehow that realization felt both terrifying and freeing at the exact same time. The most painful goodbyes are the ones nobody sees coming. 2 weeks after the gala, I stopped waiting for signs that Adrian would notice something was wrong. First, that realization hurt. Then it became strangely liberating. I no longer checked my phone every few minutes. I no longer rearranged dinner reservations when meetings ran late. I no longer sat awake staring at headlights outside the mansion, hoping the next car would be his. Instead, I started building routines that belonged entirely to me. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, I returned to the little studio above the bookstore. The landlord handed me the keys after I signed a new lease agreement. The metal felt cool in my palm. Small. Ordinary. Yet holding those keys felt more significant than any diamond necklace I had ever owned. The space slowly began transforming. Fresh paint covered the walls. New shelves appeared. Sunlight poured through the tall windows each morning. I spent hours sketching layouts and planning classes. For the first time in years, my future felt like something I was creating instead of something I was simply accompanying. Meanwhile, life inside the mansion continued exactly as before. Adrian remained consumed by work. His calendar filled weeks in advance. His phone rang constantly. His assistants appeared and disappeared carrying folders and schedules and updates. Sometimes we crossed paths in the hallway like polite strangers sharing the same hotel. One evening, he arrived home earlier than usual. I was sitting in the library reviewing paperwork for the studio when he entered carrying 2 glasses of wine. It surprised me because moments like this had become rare. He handed me 1 glass and sat across from me. "You have been quiet lately," he said. I almost laughed. Not because the comment was funny, but because it was astonishing. Quiet lately. As if the distance between us had appeared overnight. As if it had not been growing for years. "Maybe I have just been thinking," I replied. He nodded absently. "About what?" I looked at him for several seconds. This was the moment I realized. A doorway. An opportunity. If he truly wanted to know, I would tell him everything. The loneliness. The disappointment. The dreams I had buried. The sentence I could not forget. But before I could answer, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. Then again. Then a third time. Within seconds, his attention was gone. "I am sorry," he said while already standing. "This cannot wait." And just like that, the moment disappeared. The door closed behind him. I sat alone in the library holding a glass of wine neither of us had touched. Strangely, I did not cry. I did not feel angry. What I felt was certainty. Later that night, I opened my notebook and added a new item to the list. Find an apartment. The words stared back at me from the page. Simple. Direct. Real. Over the next several days, I quietly met with a realtor. I opened a private bank account using funds I had earned from investments made long before my marriage. I organized documents, sorted personal belongings, made decisions I should have made years ago. Nobody noticed. Not the house staff. Not Adrian's assistants. Not even Adrian himself. Every step felt surreal, like walking through a dream where only I knew the ending. Then one Friday evening, while organizing old files in the master bedroom, I found our wedding album tucked inside a cabinet. Dust coated the cover. I carried it to the window and slowly turned each page. There we were, smiling, laughing, looking at each other as though nothing else existed. My fingers lingered on one photograph longer than the others. Adrian's eyes were fixed entirely on me. The expression on his face was impossible to misunderstand. Once upon a time, I had been the center of his world. The question that haunted me was not what changed. The question was whether he even realized he had let me drift away. The morning I left did not feel dramatic. There was no storm outside. No argument. No final confrontation waiting to happen. The sky beyond the bedroom windows was clear, painted in soft shades of gold as the sun climbed over the city. Adrian was asleep beside me, exactly as he had been countless mornings before. For a long moment, I simply sat there watching him. The rise and fall of his breathing. The familiar curve of his hand resting against the sheets. The face I had loved for years. I kept waiting for some overwhelming emotion to stop me. A sign. A reason. Something. But all I felt was a deep and quiet sadness. Not because I was leaving. Because I had stayed this long hoping things would change. I slipped out of bed and moved through the room silently. Most of my personal belongings had already been relocated over the previous weeks. Few boxes. Some books. Family photographs. Sketches from years ago. Small pieces of myself that had gradually disappeared inside this house. Downstairs, the mansion was silent. The staff would not arrive for another hour. I walked through each room one final time. The dining room where I had eaten alone more times than I could count. The library where I had waited for conversations that never happened. The terrace where Adrian and I once spent entire evenings talking about our future. Every space held memories. Some beautiful. Some painful. All of them unfinished. In the kitchen, I placed a single envelope on the marble counter. Beside it, I carefully removed my wedding ring. The diamond caught the morning light before coming to rest against the white surface. My hands trembled slightly as I stepped back. 3 years of marriage reduced to a small circle of gold and a folded piece of paper. I stared at them for several seconds. Then I turned away. The drive across Manhattan felt strangely peaceful. Traffic was light. The city was just beginning to wake. People hurried toward coffee shops and subway stations. Delivery trucks filled side streets. Life continued exactly as it always had. For the first time in months, I did not feel trapped inside it. When I reached my new apartment above the studio, I carried the last box upstairs myself. The space was modest. 1 bedroom. Exposed brick walls. Hardwood floors. Large windows overlooking the street below. Nothing compared to the mansion. Yet standing there surrounded by sunlight and possibility, I felt lighter than I had in years. Around 9 o'clock, my phone began vibrating. Once. Twice. Then again. Adrian. I stared at his name appearing on the screen. I knew exactly what had happened. He had woken up. Walked downstairs. Seen the ring. Found the letter. My chest tightened, but I did not answer. A voicemail appeared. Then another. Then a third. I sat quietly beside the window as the city moved beneath me. Finally, after nearly an hour, I opened the letter I had written a week earlier and reread the final sentence. The same sentence Adrian would be reading at that exact moment. The same sentence that explained everything without anger, blame, or cruelty. For simple words. Now life goes on. People imagine heartbreak as something loud. They imagine shattered glass, raised voices, dramatic endings. The truth is much quieter. Sometimes heartbreak sounds like an empty house. 3 days after I left, I finally listened to one of Adrian's voicemails. I sat on the floor of my apartment surrounded by unopened boxes while sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. His voice filled the room. First he sounded confused. "Claire, call me." The second message came 2 hours later. "I do not understand what is happening." By the third message, something had changed. The confidence was gone. "Please answer your phone." I deleted none of them. I simply placed the phone face down beside me and stared out the window. Meanwhile, life inside the mansion was unfolding without me. At least that was what Adrian had always believed would happen. Later, I would learn how wrong he had been. The first morning after my departure, he reportedly skipped breakfast. Not unusual. The second morning, he asked a housekeeper if anyone had heard from me. By the third day, he was returning home earlier than normal. By the fifth, he had started wandering through rooms he rarely entered. The library. The terrace. The garden behind the house. Places that suddenly felt different without realizing why. I knew none of this at the time. My own days were beginning to take shape. The studio opened quietly. A few students arrived during the first week. A retired teacher. A college student. A young mother looking for a creative outlet. Ordinary people with ordinary lives. I loved every minute of it. For the first time in years, my evenings belonged to me. I cooked simple dinners. Walked through the neighborhood. Sat by the window with sketchbooks and coffee while city lights flickered below. Yet healing was not as simple as freedom. Some nights I still reached for my phone expecting a message from Adrian. Some mornings I woke up forgetting where I was. Grief does not disappear simply because you choose yourself. It lingers. It follows. It asks difficult questions. One rainy evening I received a call from Sophia, one of the longtime staff members at the mansion. We had become friends over the years. Her voice sounded hesitant. "I probably should not be telling you this," she said. "Telling me what?" There was a pause. "He keeps asking about you." I stared at the rain sliding down my apartment window. "That does not change anything." "I know." Another pause. "Claire, I have worked in that house for 8 years. I have never seen him like this." After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. Part of me wanted to believe it mattered. Part of me wanted to believe he finally understood. But understanding loss is not the same as understanding love. Later that night, as I locked the studio and stepped onto the sidewalk, I noticed a black car parked across the street. It remained there for only a few seconds before pulling away into traffic. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was coincidence. Yet something deep inside me whispered otherwise. Because for the first time since I walked away, I had the unmistakable feeling that Adrian Romano had stopped waiting for me to come back and had started looking for me instead. The truth rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in fragments. Receipts tucked inside drawers. Forgotten photographs. Conversations nobody realizes matter until years later. Nearly a month had passed since I left when Adrian finally stopped searching for explanations and started searching for answers. I learned that later from Sophia. Apparently, one Saturday morning, he walked into the storage room beside his home office looking for an old contract. Instead, he found boxes I had packed years ago and never opened again. Inside were notebooks, sketches, charity proposals, and letters. Pieces of a life I had quietly built around his. The first discovery was small. A folder containing records from a community center renovation project. Adrian had always believed one of his business partners handled the funding after the project nearly collapsed. What he did not know was that I had personally contributed nearly every dollar needed to keep it alive. Not for recognition. Not for publicity. Simply because children needed that place to stay open. Then came another discovery. And another. Scholarship funds donated anonymously. Medical bills paid for former employees facing hardship. Tuition assistance for the daughter of a longtime driver. Every file seemed to reveal a version of me he had never bothered to see. According to Sophia, he spent hours alone in that room. Reading. Sorting. Remembering. Meanwhile, my own life continued moving forward. The studio was thriving beyond anything I had expected. Classes filled quickly. New students arrived every week. The walls displayed paintings and photographs created by people rediscovering parts of themselves they thought were lost. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the large front windows and barely recognized the woman looking back. She stood straighter, smiled more easily, laughed without forcing it. Yet every so often, a memory would surface unexpectedly. A favorite restaurant. A song playing from a passing car. A particular brand of coffee Adrian always bought. Healing was progress, not perfection. One evening after finishing a late class, I stepped outside to lock the front door. The air carried the first hints of autumn. Leaves drifted along the sidewalk beneath glowing streetlights. That was when I noticed a familiar figure standing across the street. Not hidden. Not watching from a car. Simply standing there. Adrian. For a second, neither of us moved. He looked different. Not physically. The expensive coat, the polished shoes, the controlled posture, those remained unchanged. But something in his expression had shifted. The certainty was gone. The distance was gone. For the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain, human. Our eyes met across the traffic and evening shadows. My heart stumbled despite everything. 1,000 memories rushed through me at once. Good ones. Painful ones. All tangled together. He did not cross the street. He did not call my name. He simply stood there holding a worn notebook in one hand. Later, I would learn it was one of mine. A notebook filled with dreams I had written years earlier and forgotten. Dreams he had never known existed. The traffic light changed. Cars rolled between us. When the street cleared again, Adrian was still standing there, looking at me as though he had finally discovered something priceless after nearly losing it forever. Some people think the hardest part of leaving is walking away. They are wrong. The hardest part is discovering you can be happy after you do. For nearly 6 weeks, I had built a life that no longer revolved around Adrian Romano. My mornings belonged to the studio. My afternoons belonged to students and projects and possibilities. My evenings belonged to quiet dinners, sketchbooks, and the simple comfort of knowing exactly who I was becoming. That was why seeing him across the street unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Not because I still needed him, because I no longer did. The realization followed me for days after that encounter. I found myself thinking about the expression on his face, the notebook in his hand, the way he had not tried to force a conversation. The old Adrian would have crossed the street immediately. He would have expected answers, expected cooperation, expected control. Instead, he had simply stood there and let me choose. A week later, I was arranging paintings for an upcoming community exhibition when the bell above the studio door chimed. I looked up automatically and froze. Adrian stood inside the entrance. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows behind him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Several students worked quietly at tables nearby, completely unaware of the history standing between us. "Hello, Claire," he said softly. Hearing my name in his voice after all this time felt strange, familiar and unfamiliar at once. "Hello, Adrian." His eyes moved around the studio, the paintings, the shelves, the students laughing together near the back wall. Everything I had built. "It is beautiful," he said. "Thank you." Another silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Finally, he held out the notebook I had seen earlier. "I found this." I accepted it carefully. The worn cover felt familiar beneath my fingertips. "I forgot I even owned this." "I read it." He looked almost ashamed admitting it. Every page. My heart tightened. Years ago, I would have given anything for him to care about those dreams. Now I simply listened. "You wanted this place long before you met me," he continued. "You wrote about helping people create things they thought they had lost." His gaze shifted toward the students. "You did it." There was no jealousy in his voice, no resentment, only admiration. Somehow that hurt more than anger ever could have. "I am happy here," I said quietly. The words hung between us. A truth, a boundary, a warning. Adrian nodded slowly. "I know." For the first time I saw genuine pain in his eyes. Not because I had left, because he finally understood what he had failed to protect. We talked for nearly 20 minutes. About the studio, about the neighborhood, about ordinary things. Yet beneath every sentence lived the conversation neither of us was ready to have. Eventually he stepped toward the door. "I should go." I nodded. "Take care of yourself, Adrian." His hand rested briefly on the door handle. Then he looked back at me. The confidence that once defined him was gone. In its place stood a man carrying regret he could not hide. "Claire," he said quietly, "for what it is worth, I finally understand what I lost." Then he walked out into the fading afternoon sunlight, leaving me standing in the studio I had built for myself, wondering whether understanding had arrived too late or whether, for the first time, it had arrived exactly when it needed to. The funny thing about second chances is that they rarely look the way you imagine them. Months passed after Adrian visited the studio. Winter arrived in New York, wrapping the city in cold winds and silver skies. Life continued moving forward, but not in the direction either of us once expected. The studio expanded into the vacant space next door. New classes filled every week. Local newspapers featured stories about the community programs we had launched. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely present in my own future. Adrian never tried to interrupt that. He never asked me to give it up. He never tried to buy the building or solve my problems or reclaim the life we once shared. Instead, he changed in quieter ways. Sometimes I would receive a handwritten note congratulating the studio on a successful event. Sometimes a donation would arrive for a scholarship fund with no name attached. Sometimes I would hear from mutual friends about how he had started spending less time, chasing endless meetings and more time investing in people. Not because anyone demanded it, because he wanted to. One snowy evening in early December, the studio hosted its annual community exhibition. The rooms were filled with paintings, photographs, and sculptures created by students who once believed they had nothing worth sharing. Laughter echoed through the building. Music drifted from hidden speakers. The atmosphere felt warm despite the freezing weather outside. I was greeting guests near the entrance when I noticed Adrian standing across the room. He was alone. No assistants. No entourage. No distractions. Just Adrian. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he slowly walked toward me. "Congratulations," he said. "You built something extraordinary." I smiled. "Thank you." He glanced around the room. "I used to think success was measured by power." His voice carried a quiet honesty I had never heard before. "Now I think it is measured by how many lives become better because you were there." I looked at him carefully. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. He was still strong, still confident, but the walls were gone. The distance was gone. He finally looked like the man I used to glimpse beneath everything else. "You have changed," I said. He nodded. "Losing you forced me to." The old version of Adrian would have stopped there. He would have expected forgiveness to arrive automatically. But he surprised me. "I am not asking you to come back," he continued softly. "I am not asking for anything." His eyes met mine. "I just needed you to know that meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. And losing you became the lesson that finally taught me how to be a better man." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Snow drifted outside the windows. Guests moved through the gallery behind us. Life continued all around us. Then I reached out and took his hand. Not because the past had disappeared. Not because the pain had never happened. But because growth deserved to be recognized. Adrian looked down at our joined hands as though he could hardly believe it. I smiled softly. "Then maybe this is where we start again." His eyes closed briefly. And for the first time in years I saw pure gratitude instead of certainty. As the snow continued falling beyond the glass, I realized something important. Love had not saved us. Losing each other had. Because power built Adrian Romano's empire. But learning how to love built the man standing in front of me.